a fire that left no ashes, a relic no one dared name, and a death too quiet to be natural. In the fog-bound corridors of an ancient manor, something unseen moved. And what it left behind was fear, whispered in locked rooms and burnt pages. This is a mystery not of monsters, but of the minds they haunt. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a somber morning in the early days of November that I found myself once again seated across from Sherlock Holmes in the familiar parlour of Baker Street. Outside, the rain fell in thin, slanting lines against the panes, and the gas lamps flickered dimly in the grey light that crept in from the overcast sky. Holmes, as was his wont on such days, reclined in his armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in apparent repose. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, and aside from the rustle of the occasional newspaper, the room lay in a kind of hallowed stillness. It had been some days since a case had presented itself, and though I knew Holmes to possess extraordinary patience, there lingered about him an air of anticipation, as though he listened, not with ears, but with some inner instrument, for the faintest tremor of the unusual. "You will observe, Watson," said Holmes without opening his eyes, "that we may soon expect the arrival of a lady of aristocratic bearing, recently afflicted by personal misfortune." I started in my chair. "Good heavens, Holmes, what leads you to that conclusion?" He permitted himself a slight smile. "The matter is elementary. The ash outside the window bears the fine indentations of a carriage with steel-rimmed wheels, no doubt of the sort used by the well-to-do. The rapid rhythm of hooves suggests urgency. As for the visitor's recent misfortune, I detected it in the telegrams delivered this morning. One marked private, and another sent from Highminster Hall. Combine these with the absence of scent from your shaving lotion, and you see, our morning will not remain dull for long." Even as Holmes finished his remark, there came a brisk knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson, our long-suffering landlady, showed in a woman of poised elegance and sombre dress. She could not have been past her 40th year, yet her expression bore the weariness of one who had recently confronted grief. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she removed her veil, revealing a face of remarkable composure, were it not for the shadow behind the eyes. "Mr. Holmes," she said, inclining her head, "I am Lady Evelyn Delacroix, Duchess of Highminster. I come to you in confidence, and in haste." Holmes rose and gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "You are most welcome, Your Grace. Dr. Watson and I are at your service. Might I suggest you begin by telling us what brings you from Highminster on such a rain-blotted morning?" She hesitated only a moment, then seated herself with an air of controlled urgency. Before she could speak, Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I trust the fire has been extinguished." Lady Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound emerged. "Your gloves," Holmes said gently, "bear soot along the inner seams, and the scent of charred cedar clings faintly to your clothing. Moreover, your carriage bore signs of sudden departure. Mud splashed high upon the wheels, likely from the eastern road. Forgive me, but I would hazard that a fire broke out within the last 48 hours at your residence, one not yet made public." The Duchess stared at him, her composure momentarily broken. "That is astonishing," she murmured. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, there was a fire, but it is not the flames that trouble me, it is the silence that followed." Holmes gave a single slow nod. "Then let us speak plainly." Lady Evelyn folded her hands tightly in her lap before beginning. 2 nights ago, I hosted a private dinner for 4 guests in the Conservatory of Highminster Hall. It was meant to be a quiet gathering, informal even. There had been tensions in the household, discussions of the Duke's will, and disputes over a collection of artifacts he acquired in Mesopotamia during his last expedition. Her voice faltered for a moment. At some point during the evening, I stepped away, only briefly. When I returned, smoke was already curling beneath the conservatory doors. The fire had taken hold with unnatural speed. Lord Arlingford suffered burns attempting to quench the flames. The others fled. Holmes listened intently, his features unreadable. No valuables were taken, she continued. No injuries beyond Lord Arlingford's burns. The fire was extinguished quickly enough to prevent destruction of the main house. And yet you suspect it was no accident, Holmes finished for her. She nodded gravely. There was something about it, Mr. Holmes. A deliberate stillness, as though the fire had not ended a scene, but merely marked its beginning. I cannot go to the constabulary, she added in a whisper. You understand the consequences of scandal, especially now, with the estate already under scrutiny. My husband's death, the contested inheritance. You seek discretion, not exposure, Holmes said, his gaze now sharp with purpose. Precisely. He leaned forward, fingers steepled once more. Then you have come to the right place, Your Grace. This fire shall not smoulder unseen, not while Sherlock Holmes has breath in his body. And thus began the strange case of the fire in the Duchess's conservatory. Lady Evelyn sat with her gloved hands folded tightly, as though the act of recollection required some physical anchoring. Her composure, though admirable, bore the hairline fractures of recent trauma. It was not merely a fire, Mr. Holmes, she began, her voice measured and low, but something far more insidious. An act wrapped in civility and smoke. Holmes inclined his head, urging her gently to proceed. The evening had begun peaceably enough. I had arranged a private dinner in the conservatory, an intimate gathering, confined to 4 guests of personal and familial import. The matter of the Duke's estate has, as you may expect, created certain tensions. I had hoped the informal setting might cool what formalities had failed to resolve. She paused then, her gaze momentarily unfocused. But there was something in the air, Mr. Holmes, a friction one might feel rather than hear. Words were exchanged, not loud, but pointed. I left for no more than 10 minutes, perhaps to retrieve a letter from the library. When I returned, the room was filled with smoke, and the scent of burning ivy clung to every wall. Holmes, who had listened in unbroken silence, now interjected with a single word. Guests, the Duchess nodded. Yes, Lord Reginald Arlingford, a cousin of my late husband's. Miss Sylvia Grey, my niece. Dr. Ellery Fitch, an archaeologist of some repute. And Basil Hume, the family solicitor. Each with a stake in the estate? Holmes asked. Lady Evelyn offered a faint smile. You read quickly between lines, Mr. Holmes. There was disagreement, she continued, over a collection of Mesopotamian artifacts the Duke acquired during his last journey abroad. Lord Arlingford considered them little more than pagan bric-a-brac. Dr. Fitch disagreed with particular vehemence. The conversation veered sharply when the matter of inheritance arose. Who ought to inherit the collection, and whether the Duke's intentions had been faithfully executed. And you left them in this atmosphere? Holmes inquired. For a brief moment only, she said. But in hindsight, the tension that evening seemed like the trembling of a bridge before its collapse. I believe now that something decisive was set into motion before I rose from my chair. She continued, her voice soft but resolute. When I returned, it was Sylvia who screamed. The conservatory doors had been shut, and smoke was already coiling through the cracks. I flung them open and found flames licking along the base of the eastern trellis. The palm leaves had caught fire, and Lord Arlingford, his sleeve aflame, was staggering backward, coughing violently. I rang for assistance, and the staff responded swiftly. The blaze was extinguished within minutes. Yet what troubled me most, Mr. Holmes, was not the speed with which the fire spread, but the odd manner of it. It burned with precision, as though it had chosen a path. Was anyone injured beyond Lord Arlingford? I asked. Only minor burns. But I noted afterwards, in the stillness that follows catastrophe, that none of the objects in the collection had been touched. No glass broken, no cabinets disturbed. It was not theft, nor was it accident. Holmes drew his fingertips together, his expression unreadable. The fire, then, was not an end, but a signal. At Holmes's prompting, the Duchess spoke again, more guardedly now. My late husband, she said, was a man of science, at least outwardly. But toward the end of his life, he grew secretive. His journals, which I was never permitted to read, became his constant companions. He spoke of signs, inscriptions, energies, things no rational man ought to consider credible. She hesitated. There was one artifact in particular, a disc of clay bearing the name of Namtar, a Mesopotamian god of death. He believed it to be significant. Did he believe it cursed? Holmes asked. I cannot say with certainty, but I do recall his final days were plagued by fevered dreams and a profound unease. He once muttered, in a half-sleeping state, that he had brought a god into a house of men. He died within a fortnight. Holmes said nothing, but his gaze sharpened. I am aware of how this sounds, Lady Evelyn added quickly, and I assure you I do not subscribe to tales of the supernatural, but I am a woman bound by name and estate, and scandal, Mr. Holmes, is its own kind of fire. That is why I cannot summon the authorities. I understood now the tightness in her shoulders, the careful moderation of every word. Her burden was not merely fear, but the crushing weight of social expectation. Were the press to learn of the fire, or of the argument, or the strange history of that room, she said, the estate would be forever stained. My husband's name already suffers whispers. I will not allow it to descend into rumour and ridicule. Holmes's voice was low but steady. Then you ask for clarity, not comfort, for the truth, whatever shape it may take. Yes, she replied, but in silence, if you please. Holmes tapped a long finger against the armrest of his chair. Tell me, if you would, more of the guests, of their temperaments. Lord Arlingford, the Duchess began, is a man of inherited pride and diminishing fortune. He resents the changes brought by the Duke's will and believes himself cheated of rightful legacy. He masks his bitterness in gruff humour, but it is a thin disguise. She turned slightly. Mr. Basil Hume is the solicitor, dutiful, but increasingly evasive. I caught him packing his satchel before the fire had been doused. When questioned, he claimed prior engagements in town. And Dr. Fitch, a brilliant archaeologist, but unnervingly intense. He speaks often of the ancient world as though it breathes still. My husband trusted him implicitly, perhaps too much. And Miss Grey, my niece, shy, observant. She says little, but watches everything. Since the fire, she has withdrawn even further. Holmes nodded. Then we have tension, motive, opportunity, and the shadow of something older than law. I glanced at him, for I knew by his tone that his mind was already sharpening upon the edge of the problem. For a long moment, Holmes remained silent, lost in a stillness that belied the velocity of his thought. At last, he rose from his chair and approached the fire, his back to us. There is something about this matter, he said slowly, that touches both the symbolic and the tangible, a fire that leaves artifacts untouched, a death-haunted relic, a house poised between secrecy and revelation. He turned, eyes alight with the inner fire I had seen only when a case had seized him fully. Your Grace, you have my word that I shall investigate this matter with the utmost discretion. Dr. Watson will accompany me. I ask only that we be permitted to visit the scene under a plausible pretext. perhaps as agents of your insurer or advisors on the preservation of antiquities. Relief passed visibly across Lady Evelyn's features. Anything you require, Mr. Holmes. He inclined his head. Then let us begin, for I suspect that the flames we now chase may yet burn through layers far deeper than brick and glass. We departed Baker Street the following morning, beneath a veil of civility and fog. Lady Evelyn had arranged for our arrival under the guise of being representatives from her insurance firm, tasked with assessing potential structural damage and itemizing losses of value. The ruse suited Holmes admirably, for it afforded him liberty of movement and inquiry within the estate, while avoiding the shackles of suspicion that so often tighten when a known detective enters a case. Highminster Hall rose from its moor like an aging sovereign, graceful but touched by melancholy. Its brickwork, weathered and ivy-bound, concealed histories not easily read by the untrained eye. Yet Holmes, ever the student of physical traces and silent evidence, regarded it with quiet intensity. Our arrival was met with a subdued courtesy. Servants were instructed to offer every convenience. The guests still in residence were told nothing of our purpose, and though the tone of the household was polite, there lingered a current of unease beneath the fine manners and polished banisters. A sense that not all who remained beneath that roof did so willingly or without watching eyes. Our first order of business was the conservatory, the scene of the flame and, quite possibly, of the crime. The room had once been a place of cultivated tranquillity, filled with palms, hothouse orchids, and the subtle humidity of managed growth. Now it stood ravaged, though the damage had not reached catastrophic levels. Char streaked the walls where creepers had once clung, and the air still bore the faint, sour tang of chemical smoke. Holmes moved through the space with his usual economy, eyes scanning, fingers gliding along surfaces, boots stepping only where soot had already laid claim. "Note," he said, crouching near the trellised window, "the fire's path. It did not spread chaotically, as would be expected from a candle or hearth ember. Rather, it followed a low trail, from the base of that display cabinet, along the lattice frame, to the foot of the central fern stand. I observed the pattern and saw it as he did, deliberate, almost linear." "An accelerant, perhaps?" I asked. "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, "but more than that, a guiding hand. Fire is a wild thing, Watson, unless coaxed. This was coaxed, and it was intended not to consume all, but to suggest something had nearly been lost." It was near the base of the scorched orchid stand that Holmes stooped, his eye drawn to a scorched fragment barely distinguishable from the blackened rubble surrounding it. He lifted it with delicate precision, using a thin blade from his kit. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over. "Linen," he murmured, but with something curious about it. The small patch of fabric, no larger than a gentleman's handkerchief, bore clear signs of combustion, yet at its edges clung a residue, yellowish, translucent, and faintly aromatic. "Wax," I said, catching the scent. Holmes nodded. "Not from a common candle, I think. Something prepared, perhaps a sealing wax or ceremonial compound. Note the way it's soaked into the fibres without hardening. It suggests use prior to ignition, a surface coating rather than a byproduct." He sniffed lightly and narrowed his eyes. "There's a scent here I can't place, something resinous, ancient. Do you believe it was part of a ritual?" "I believe," he replied quietly, "that someone wished us to think so, or feared it so greatly they tried to erase the evidence in flame." We continued our quiet search amid the wreckage, Holmes trailing his gaze beneath tables and potted remnants, until he paused at the far end of the conservatory, where a planter, cracked and blackened, had fallen beside a wrought-iron bench. He knelt and brushed aside soil and ash. "What have we here?" Nestled among the debris was a disc-shaped object, the size of a pocket watch but thicker, earthen in hue, and unbroken despite its proximity to flame. Holmes turned it over in his hand, and I glimpsed strange markings, etched not with English letters, but with angular symbols foreign to my understanding. Cuneiform, Holmes said. Sumerian, if I'm not mistaken. A genuine artifact, though its presence here is more recent than its origin. Could it have belonged to the Duke's collection? I ventured. Holmes studied it. Very likely. But why place it here, under a planter? And why survive the fire when more durable things have crumbled? He slid the disc into a padded pouch and stood. It is not the most damning of clues, Watson, but it may yet prove the most ancient, and in that, possibly the most feared. As Holmes continued his examination, I found Miss Sylvia Grey walking the western corridor alone, her slender frame nearly swallowed by the heavy woodwork and high ceilings of the hall. She started slightly when I addressed her, but composed herself quickly. "Doctor, Watson," she said, "I presume you and Mr. Holmes are not simply here for insurance purposes." I hesitated, then nodded. "You may trust our discretion, Miss Grey." She glanced away. "There are things I could say, Doctor, things I should say, but I fear to speak them aloud, not for my own sake, but for what they might awaken." "There was more to that night than the fire," I said gently. She nodded. "It was not the fire that frightened me. It was the silence before it." Her voice quavered, and before I could press further, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. I returned to Holmes with a growing sense that fear, not malice, had bound more than one person to silence. Lord Arlingford received us with the reluctant civility of a man who tolerated guests but despised questions. His bandaged wrist and the pink scarring at his temple bore witness to his brush with flame. But if he harboured any gratitude for surviving, it was buried beneath layers of resentment. "I dare say you've come to inspect the ruins and nod wisely at soot," he said. "Merely following the patterns fire leaves behind," Holmes replied mildly. Arlingford scoffed. "Patterns? My dear sir, there are no patterns in madness." Holmes studied him for a moment. "You believe it madness, then?" Arlingford's eyes narrowed. "My cousin dabbled in nonsense, symbols and relics. He brought things into this house that had no place among the living." "Did you see anything unusual the night of the fire?" "I saw smoke, and I tried to save what I could. Beyond that, I saw a woman's eyes watching from the dark. That's all." Holmes said nothing, but I caught the flicker of thought passing silently behind his gaze. Dr. Ellery Fitch was found in the study, seated amidst open books and scattered parchment, as though to conjure knowledge by sheer presence. He rose when we entered, his thin frame angular beneath his coat, and his fingers bore the faint yellow stains of tobacco and ink. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I expected you sooner." Holmes inclined his head. "We've just come from the Conservatory. Unfortunate affair. Fire and ancient relics seldom mix well." "Do you believe the collection was targeted?" Fitch hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I believe fear is the oldest contagion. A single whispered legend can undo a generation's science." "Were you fearful that night, Doctor?" His fingers tightened on the edge of a desk. "Fear and awe are close cousins. But I've seen enough tombs to know that death is seldom patient with those who pry." As Holmes questioned him further, I noted a trembling in the doctor's hand when the subject of the sun disk arose, subtle but unmistakable. It was not the tremor of age, but of conscience or dread. Mr. Basil Hume, the family solicitor, greeted us with the forced warmth of a man hoping conversation would end quickly. His valise stood packed by the door, a cab summoned in advance of our arrival. "I regret I must return to London this evening," he said, dabbing his brow. Estate affairs do not rest. Indeed, said Holmes, especially when the estate contains such combustible elements. Hume paled slightly. The fire was regrettable. And the Duke's journals, were they likewise regrettable? The solicitor blinked. I'm not aware of their contents, merely that they were private. And now lost? I presume so. Holmes's eyes locked on the man for a moment. A tick fluttered at the corner of Hume's eye. I wish you safe travels, Mr. Hume, Holmes said coolly, though I fear the past has a way of following its handlers. As Hume departed, I could not help but feel that his haste masked more than mere discomfort with fire. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested to see the estate's wine cellar under the pretext of inspecting damage to the temperature control systems. The butler, a stoic fellow named Gibbs, led us down into the stone-lined chamber. Holmes moved along the shelves with practiced ease, his eyes not on the vintages, but the spaces between them. Here, he said, reaching behind a bottle of claret. He withdrew a small glass vessel, Persian in style, blue-tinted, and capped in brass. An oil bottle, I said. More than that, Holmes replied, uncorking it slightly. The scent is unmistakable, naphtha, used commonly in Mesopotamian lamps, highly flammable. Placed here deliberately? Perhaps, but why in the wine cellar? He paused, holding the bottle to the light. It does not belong among spirits. It belongs to the spirit of fear, a relic tucked away in hopes it might not be found. Holmes resealed it and handed it to me with care. Every room in this house holds echoes, Watson. Some speak softly, others burn. Holmes returned once more to the conservatory that evening unsatisfied. As twilight fell through the soot-streaked glass, he moved to the very centre of the room where the fire had burned fiercest. Here, he said, gesturing for a lantern. I held it low as he knelt. Using his lens and a soft cloth, he gently cleaned a scorched tile, revealing not soot, but scratched marks beneath it. Hieroglyphs, he murmured. Not cuneiform. Egyptian, perhaps, but not expertly rendered. Someone etched them deliberately, I asked. Yes, and before the fire. See how the scorch radiates outward, but does not erase the markings. Whoever inscribed this meant it to be found, or feared it would be. He traced the lines with his finger. It is a crude invocation, Watson, an attempt at protection, or perhaps appeasement. We stood in silence for a moment, the fading light casting long shadows across the ruined floor. Someone believed, Holmes said finally, and belief, when joined to desperation, can ignite more than flame. It can burn through reason. I said nothing, but I felt then that our case had crossed the line from calculated malice into something darker, something born of dread. It was well past midnight, when the stillness of Highminster Hall was disturbed once more. A faint creak, too measured to be the groan of an old beam, reached our ears as we lay in adjoining rooms at the far end of the guest corridor. I was fully awake in an instant, for Holmes had warned me earlier that disturbances rarely occurred in isolation. I met him already fully dressed, his hand resting lightly on the door latch. He gestured silently, and together we descended the stairs, moving with caution through the candle-lit hush of the great house. The sound had emanated from the library. The door stood ajar. We stepped inside. Shelves loomed like sentinels, their contents casting elongated shadows across the carpet. One window was open, the curtains stirred by a cold wind, and the faintest trace of movement, perhaps the edge of a coat or sleeve, vanished behind the corner of a tall bookcase. Holmes raised his hand to halt me. We stood for a long moment in the silence that follows intrusion. Then Holmes knelt beside the doorframe and nodded, satisfied. You see, Watson, he said in a whisper, we are not the only seekers of buried knowledge. At the base of the doorframe, Scarcely visible unless one knew precisely where to look, lay the broken remains of a thin thread of wax Holmes had laid earlier in the day, his customary method of detecting passage through unguarded thresholds. It had been placed across the inner seam, sealed delicately so that the opening of the door would shear it invisibly. "Someone has entered the library since we retired," he said. "And not long ago. The draft remains fresh." He retrieved the small piece, held it to the candlelight, and nodded. "I suspected this room might invite company," he continued. "And it seems the bait has drawn interest." From the shadows beyond the bookcase, a footstep retreated. Holmes stood at once, his voice cold and clear. "Come out, Dr. Fitch. There is no use in hiding now." From behind the shelves emerged the figure of Dr. Ellery Fitch, his appearance pale and drawn, his coat unfastened and spectacles askew. "I meant no harm," he said quickly. I sought only information." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "At this hour?" Fitch's gaze darted toward the hearth. "I suspected there might be material left behind. Writings, perhaps. The Duke often made notations late at night." "Then you will not object if we search the room," Holmes said calmly. "You see, Doctor, I find it curious that one so learned should seek knowledge only when the house sleeps." Fitch's hands trembled slightly. "I feared interruption. This house is not what it once was. The fire, the past, it casts a long shadow." "And what precisely did you hope to find?" "The journal," Fitch confessed. "The Duke's personal writings. He made references to the disc, its energy, its meaning. I had to know what he truly believed." Holmes stared at him without expression. "Then let us see if the ashes conceal more than soot." Holmes approached the fireplace with quiet purpose, his eyes scanning the hearth before kneeling beside the soot-blackened grate. A faint smell of burnt parchment lingered in the air, delicate but unmistakable. Within the iron urn that stood to one side, he found what he had suspected: fragments of paper, charred but not entirely consumed. Using a pair of tongs and the utmost care, he extracted them, placing them on the study desk beneath the glow of the oil lamp. The fragments bore signs of hasty destruction. On one edge, the name Namtar was partially visible, ink scrawled in hurried hand. Another bore a sketched image, a disc surrounded by notations in Latin and Greek. Holmes examined the largest piece. "The journal was here, Dr. Fitch, and someone feared what it contained." Fitch turned pale. "I only arrived. I did not—" "No," Holmes said curtly. "But someone else did. Someone who believes that superstition, once revealed, is more dangerous than fire." He turned to me. "Watson, there is something deeper at play, something older than fear alone." The following morning brought not calm, but escalation. Lady Evelyn summoned us before breakfast, her complexion drawn and her hands clasped with unnatural rigidity. Upon her writing desk lay a folded piece of parchment, unsigned, unsealed. It bore a single line, scrawled in block letters by a hand unpracticed in grace: "He who digs up the past risks being buried in it." Holmes studied it in silence, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the page. "It is not the wording of a thief," he said, "nor of one merely afraid. It is a creed, an expression of conviction." "Then someone wishes to silence me?" Lady Evelyn asked. "Or themselves," Holmes replied. "Those who fear discovery sometimes threaten others, not out of power, but desperation." The Duchess said nothing more, but her eyes, though steady, glistened faintly at the corners. I knew then that she feared not only for herself, but for the memory of the man she had once trusted, beyond all reason. Later that day, Lady Evelyn requested Holmes and me to join her in the small music room at the rear of the house, a chamber seldom used since the Duke's passing. The air within was still, as though years of silence lingered despite open windows. "I have kept much from you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low. "Not out of deceit, but out of shame." Holmes bowed his head slightly. "I am not here to pass judgment, Your Grace." She looked to the old pianoforte, its ivory keys dulled by disuse. "My husband believed that one of the artifacts he brought from Nineveh, or what remains of it, was not simply historical. He claimed it bore a presence, a shadow of something enduring." "A spirit?" I asked. She shook her head. "Number, not a ghost. He called it a seal, of binding, that the disc was created to contain something no longer human. Madness, I thought. And yet he grew distant, obsessed, withdrawn. I once found him kneeling before it at night, speaking in a language I did not know." Holmes remained quiet, but I could feel the shift in his attention. Something had connected within him. "My husband claimed the disc bore the name of Namtar," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He said it was the emblem of a god of disease and misfortune, one not worshipped, but feared." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room. "He found the disc in the ruins of a ziggurat," she went on. "It was buried beneath layers of temple debris, as if hidden deliberately. The locals refused to touch it. They warned him. He laughed at their warnings." Holmes asked quietly, "And did he laugh still in the end?" She hesitated. Number his final days were marked by hallucinations, fevers, whispers in the dark. He told me once that the disc had awoken, that it wanted to return. "To return where?" She did not answer, or could not. Holmes stood slowly and turned toward the window. "Sometimes belief is the kindling, but superstition, once inflamed, becomes harder to extinguish than fire itself." I had no reply, only questions that deepened like the dusk. Holmes did not speak for the remainder of the afternoon. He walked the grounds in measured silence, pausing often beneath windows, beside hedgerows, near the conservatory's scorched edge. His brow furrowed not in confusion, but in thought so singular it resisted all interruption. I joined him once, but he offered no comment, only a glance that seemed to weigh every word I might offer before dismissing them unspoken. At dusk, he returned indoors without ceremony and sat once more in the library, where the fire now burned low. Something, I knew, had arranged itself in his mind, and the shape of it would soon take form. It was just after breakfast, with the hall still stirring from the silence of morning, when a scream pierced the air, a sharp cry from the gardener's boy, shrill enough to turn heads and halt hands. Holmes and I had scarcely risen from our tea before a footman appeared, pale and breathless, announcing that a body had been discovered in the lower orchard. We followed him quickly through the dew-slit grass and past the withering trees until we came upon the scene. There, beneath a gnarled apple tree, lay the body of Lord Arlingford. He was sprawled as if he had sat and then slumped, one arm across his chest, the other fallen at his side. His lips bore the bluish tinge of some internal rupture, and the veins in his hands were darkened as though some thick draught had clotted within them. Holmes examined him briefly, then looked to the crushed patch of grass beside the tree. "No wound," he said quietly. "No struggle. This was not accident or fall." He bent lower, his expression unreadable. "This, Watson, was poison, and not of an English make." Holmes motioned for the gardener and sent him to summon the house staff, insisting that none approach the orchard. Then, drawing a small case from his coat, he extracted a glass vial and began a rapid examination of the man's lips and fingertips. "There is a bitterness here," he said, "a trace of resinous compound. Familiar, though not common." He dabbed a swab at the edge of Arlingford's tongue and held it to his nose. "Yes," he murmured. "Watson, this is likely derived from the Scilla mesopotamica, a plant native to the Euphrates basin. The Duke once wrote of it in relation to the burial rites of Namtar." I stared at him. But surely such a poison would be known only to specialists. "Or to those who have studied in the shadow of ruins," Holmes replied. He turned back to the corpse. This was no random death. Someone knew the properties, procured the substance, and administered it with precision. And the motive? "That," he said darkly, "may lie in what Arlingford knew, or intended to expose." As the body was left undisturbed and the house summoned, Holmes's eyes were already upon the earth. The orchard grass still bore the sheen of morning dew, undisturbed except for a series of footprints that approached from the eastern path. Holmes followed them in silence, his gaze focused, his gait careful not to interrupt the trace. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, crouching. "Here is Arlingford's tread, heavy, direct. But here, see how the steps narrow, hesitant. The heel barely presses into the ground." I looked closely. A second set of prints met Arlingford's path, lighter, almost delicate. "A woman?" I ventured. Holmes nodded. "And she came alone. No signs of escort. She approached him directly, paused here, note the turned print, and then both prints vanish in this trampled arc." He stood slowly. "She met him here. They spoke, and then he died." "And she?" "Either she fled, or she watched until certainty overcame conscience." The implications were chilling. The village constable arrived in due course. A sturdy man named Hughes, with a red face, square jaw, and the air of one accustomed to simpler offences. He listened with stiff attentiveness as Holmes described the discovery and the nature of the woundless death. "Poison, you say?" he grunted. "Foreign stuff, eh? Well, we'll need statements from all who were near the orchard this morning." Holmes offered a courteous nod, though I could sense his reluctance to cede any part of the inquiry to official hands. "I should like to conduct a few interviews myself," Holmes said. "Of course," Hughes replied. "But I'll need suspects, Mr. Holmes. Folk don't poison noblemen without reason." Holmes gave a small enigmatic smile. "Nor do they light fires in conservatories without cause." The constable frowned. I saw then that Holmes had already seen further into this case than the law was prepared to follow. Within hours, the house was thick with murmurings. Servants exchanged furtive glances, and the air of suspicion settled with an oppressive weight. It was the housekeeper, a discreet but observant woman, who first mentioned the possibility of a prior closeness between Lord Arlingford and Miss Sylvia Grey. "I never say more than what I see," she told me in private. "But he used to visit the West Terrace where Miss Grey walked each evening. They talked, sir, not loud, but long." "And of late?" I inquired. "There was an argument not a week past, sharp voices. She cried after." Holmes, hearing this, said nothing at first. Then, with a thoughtful expression, he asked to see Miss Grey. "I do not say she is guilty," he murmured to me as we ascended the stairs. "But we must now separate the fires of passion from the smoke of accusation." His eyes, as ever, missed nothing. Miss Grey received us in her chambers, pale but composed. Her hands were folded and her eyes betrayed little, save exhaustion. "I understand," she said softly, "that Lord Arlingford is dead." Holmes inclined his head. "May I speak plainly, Miss Grey?" "Please." "Were you once engaged to him?" She flinched, then nodded. "It was to be kept private. He wished to delay the announcement until the estate matters were settled." "And why the secrecy?" "There were disagreements. He feared that our connection would be used to question his claims to the Duke's collection." "And what caused the quarrel?" She looked away. "He changed, Mr. Holmes, after the fire. He became erratic, angry. He accused me of withholding information I did not possess. Her voice trembled slightly. I ended it 2 days ago. Holmes's gaze was steady. Did you meet him this morning? She hesitated. Yes, in the orchard. But I left him well. I swear it. There was no guile in her voice, only sorrow. Despite Miss Grey's protestations, the convergence of circumstance proved too great for the constable to ignore. Her presence at the scene, the quarrel, the secrecy, all weighed heavily in the scales of suspicion. By midday, she was escorted to her chambers under informal custody, pending further inquiry. I found her there shortly after, seated at the edge of her bed, hands resting lightly in her lap. I did not poison him, Doctor. Watson, she said quietly. I believe you, I replied. And Mr. Holmes? He is not yet convinced of any single truth. That is his strength. She gave a faint, bitter smile. It will not be enough. Holmes, for his part, said little. He moved through the house with a sharpness I had come to recognize, not of confusion but of calculated reserve. He was watching, weighing, assembling. Whatever theory he harbored, he kept close. But I knew one thing with certainty. He did not believe Miss Grey had taken a life that morning. That evening, as the house settled into its uneasy hush, I found Holmes in the drawing room, seated before the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Do you believe her? I asked. He did not move. Yes. But the footprints, her presence, are suggestive, he interrupted, but not conclusive. Every element of this case thus far has pointed not toward passion, but toward orchestration. Then who? That, he said, requires further testing. He stood and walked slowly to the window, gazing into the dark beyond. There is a shape beneath this, something deliberately masked by fire, confusion, and now death. Whoever orchestrated this is not impulsive. They are patient, and they are clever. I followed his gaze, though I saw nothing in the garden but mist and shadow. And Miss Grey? She is a pawn, Watson. One placed in danger, not by guilt, but by silence. He turned to me. Tomorrow we set the board. It was early the following morning when Holmes handed me a folded copy of the Highminster Chronicle, its ink still fresh with the scent of the press. His eyes gleamed with a satisfaction I had come to know well, an indication that a trap had been laid and bait set with precision. I unfolded the paper to find a brief notice in the second column. Ancient relic survives manor fire. Clay sun disk believed lost found intact. Holmes had arranged its placement discreetly through a contact at the publication, ostensibly as an anonymous update from the insurers. It claimed, falsely, that the artifact had been located in the ruins, catalogued and secured. I presume this is untrue, I asked. Entirely, Holmes replied, but I am wagering it will not remain so in the mind of our adversary. You believe the thief still believes it real? Not merely real, Watson, Holmes murmured. Essential. For what drives men to murder is not always wealth, but the fear of losing what they cannot bear to let go. That afternoon, Holmes extended an invitation to Dr. Fitch for tea in the drawing room, framing the meeting as an informal consultation on Mesopotamian iconography. The doctor accepted, though I noticed the wariness in his eyes as he entered. The folds of his collar sat less crisply than usual, and his fingers, when he reached for the teacup, bore the slightest tremor. Holmes engaged him amiably at first, speaking of the disc and the fictional report of its survival. He feigned curiosity, then marvel, praising its resilience and hinting at its possible rediscovery. Fitch remained silent for a time, then muttered, "Then it survived the fire after all?" "So the paper suggests," Holmes replied, his tone as light as porcelain. Strange, isn't it, that such a piece should endure flame untouched? Fitch's knuckles whitened on his teacup. Holmes let the silence stretch, then offered a small smile. "I find it fascinating, Doctor, how superstition often lends strength to the fragile and fragility to the strong." The remainder of the conversation was brief, but Fitch left with his tea unfinished, and Holmes did not watch him go. That night, as darkness crept across the grounds, and the lamps within the manor dwindled one by one, Holmes and I took our place in a sheltered recess beside the conservatory. The air was cool and damp, the earth still soft from the rain 2 nights prior. Holmes remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the garden path, his breath nearly imperceptible. Time passed slowly. Then, just as the moon slipped free from its veil of cloud, we saw him. Dr. Fitch moved like a man accustomed to silence. He crossed the grass with deliberation, a cloth bundle in one hand, his coat collar turned high against the wind. His manner bore none of the ease of a casual evening stroll. It was the movement of one driven by need, not whim. He paused near the scorched patch where once the great fern stood and began to kneel. Holmes's hand gripped my arm gently. "Now," he whispered. "Watch. We shall see what treasure drives a man to descend into fire and fear." Fitch knelt in the ashen soil with the air of one revisiting a grave. His hands moved quickly, brushing aside scorched leaves and loosened soil, fingers scrabbling in the black earth with increasing desperation. At last, he uncovered something. The clay disc Holmes had earlier retrieved and concealed elsewhere. But Holmes had returned it that very afternoon, placing it beneath the planter from which it had first emerged, precisely for this moment. Fitch drew the object forth with a kind of reverence, cradling it in both hands. His breath grew short, as though the mere act of touching it confirmed some private dread. His voice, when he spoke, was scarcely more than a whisper. "You are still here." He held the token up to the moonlight, examining it with a scholar's gaze and a zealot's awe. But before his second breath had drawn, Holmes stepped forward into the clearing, calm and deliberate. "That," he said, "is far enough, Dr. Fitch. Let us not pretend to study what you have already killed to possess." Fitch froze, the token still in his hand, his face turned toward Holmes with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly, "you misunderstand." "I seldom do," Holmes replied coldly. "Stand up." Fitch obeyed, slowly, the token now trembling in his grip. Holmes took a step closer, his gaze never shifting. "You returned here not to study, but to reclaim. You believed the disc destroyed in the fire you yourself set. Imagine your dismay to read that it had survived." Fitch's lips parted, but Holmes raised a hand. "You set the fire to conceal your theft. The journal was burned later, to eliminate its trail. But when you learned the disc had supposedly survived, your fear outweighed your caution." "You speak of motives as if you know my soul," Fitch whispered. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "I know your fear, Doctor. And I know what you fear most, that the object you believed to hold power now bears witness to your crimes." The silence that followed was unbroken, but by the wind through the grass, and the dull drop of the token falling from Fitch's fingers to the soil. Holmes's voice grew more measured, his tone less accusatory than precise, as though merely noting the turning of celestial gears. "You knew the Duke believed the disc was dangerous," he said. "You indulged his obsession, perhaps even encouraged it. But after his death, the matter of inheritance threatened to expose your private ambition." He turned slightly, addressing me as if to make it plain for my record. "Dr. Fitch feared that Arlingford would demand the collection undergo scholarly review, revealing in time that the artifact was not ancient magic, but a forgery. His reputation and his influence over the Duchess would be undone." He turned back to Fitch. "You planned the fire, believing it would both destroy the disc and confuse suspicion. But Arlingford saw something, perhaps the theft, or your behaviour that night, and tried to use it against you. Fitch's face was pale, his mouth drawn taut. You lured him to the orchard, Holmes continued. There, you administered the poison, a rare compound the Duke had once described to you in his journal. And now, Holmes said softly, the chain of deceit has come full circle, drawn tight by your own superstitions. Fitch's shoulders sagged as Holmes finished. The wind stirred his coat, but he made no move to run. Instead, he turned to me with a look of such quiet despair that I felt pity wrestle briefly with judgment. I did not want the disc for fame, he said. I feared it. I thought, if I destroyed it, the voices would stop. Holmes stepped forward. So you killed to silence a whisper that came from your own guilt. Fitch gave a weary nod. I wrote the letter to frighten her. To frighten myself, perhaps. Holmes retrieved the note from his coat and held it up. An academic's cadence, he said. An archaeologist's idiom, disguised as threat. Your words betrayed you, Doctor, not your footsteps. As the sound of approaching hooves broke the silence, Scotland Yard summoned hours before, Fitch lowered his head and let the token fall once more to the earth. Fitch did not resist when Holmes stepped forward. The clay token slipped once more from his fingers, landing softly in the grass. The archaeologist remained still, his breath shallow, his eyes wide and unblinking as Holmes's gaze met his with unflinching intensity. I did not intend it, he said hoarsely. Not at first. His voice cracked, not with the strain of guilt alone, but with the exhaustion of a man who had carried too great a burden beneath too brittle a shell. Holmes did not speak. His silence pressed upon Fitch more than any accusation could have. I thought if I could remove it, Fitch continued, if I could erase it, perhaps I could silence it. He lowered himself to his knees, not in supplication, but defeat. The fire was meant for the disc, the journal too, but Arlingford, he knew. His voice broke. He threatened to expose everything, and I panicked. I didn't see a man. I saw an opening flame, a roaring curse, and I acted. Holmes's brow remained composed, his voice even. And in so doing, you became the very myth you sought to destroy. Fitch sat back on his heels, staring not at us, but through us. His gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the garden or its sorrowful secrets. I first heard of the disc in Nineveh, he said quietly. It was spoken of in hushed tones by the workers, a funerary object, they claimed. Not placed with the dead, but used to keep something dead. A seal, not to sanctify, but to contain. He drew a slow breath. When the Duke brought it back, he mocked their warnings. But I watched. I saw how his dreams turned fevered, how he stopped sleeping altogether, how he began hearing sounds that were not there. He pressed his hand to his forehead. I told myself it was fatigue, guilt, madness, but then I began to hear them too, whispers, tremors in the dark. Hallucinations, Holmes said, though not unkindly. Perhaps, Fitch whispered, but real enough to drive a man to set fire to the world if only to drown the voices. He turned to Holmes, his eyes hollow. Do you not believe in such things? Holmes replied softly, I believe in what men will do when they do. Fitch's confession unfolded like the crumbling of an ancient wall, slow at first, then all at once. Arlingford discovered me the night of the fire, he said. I had removed the disc and was preparing to destroy it. He saw me. I tried to explain, but he only laughed. Fitch's expression twisted. He said it was a trinket, worthless to scholars, priceless to collectors. He offered to remain silent if I agreed to let him broker its sale. Said he knew men who would pay dearly. He blackmailed you, I said quietly. Fitch nodded. He would not be denied. He gave me 3 days to decide. And you chose silence, Holmes murmured. No, Fitch said. I chose survival. I tried to reason with him in the orchard, but he brought the vial with him, a sample from the Duke's collection. Said it was ironic I feared a disc, when a drop of poison held greater power. His voice dropped to a whisper. I took it from him, and I used it, not for gain, only to end the threat, only to end the fear. I stood quietly beside Holmes, the weight of Fitch's words hanging in the cold morning air. Though the man before us was undeniably guilty, his guilt wore not the face of wickedness, but that of a mind slowly undone by its own convictions. He had not murdered from avarice, nor set flame from cruelty. No, his every act had been shaped by a creeping terror, disguised for months beneath the language of scholarship and ritual. I could not help but pity him. How fine, I thought, is the line between genius and madness. How easily a brilliant man, once so certain of the world's rationality, could be seduced by its shadows. Perhaps it was the setting, beneath the charred silhouette of the conservatory, amid the silent stares of sleeping flowers. But I felt then the ache of some ancient grief, not merely personal, but human. And I wondered, how many truths in this world are abandoned not for lack of evidence, but because belief becomes too heavy to bear? Holmes remained standing, his silhouette outlined by the first ashen rays of dawn. His voice, when it came, was low and unshaken. You speak of fear, he said to Fitch, as though it were its own exoneration. But fear, Doctor, is neither shield nor sentence. It is motive, and like all motives, it must be weighed. Fitch bowed his head. You acted not out of malevolence, Holmes continued, but out of a belief that the object you held was dangerous beyond comprehension. You fed that belief, let it fester until it shaped your every action. He stepped closer. But belief, however deeply held, does not grant one license to extinguish life. I watched as Holmes knelt and picked up the token, holding it between thumb and forefinger. This, he said, is a relic. Perhaps it once bore meaning, but the deaths it has caused stem not from curse but from conviction. He handed the disc to me. Watson, see to it this finds its way to a museum, not as a weapon, but as a warning. The light of morning had only just breached the horizon when the carriage from Scotland Yard arrived. The hooves of the bay geldings rang sharp against the gravel, and the figure who stepped out wore the unmistakable grey of London authority. Inspector Lestrade, summoned hours prior by Holmes's brief but sufficient telegram, approached without ceremony. Holmes offered a quiet nod. You'll find your man waiting. Fitch stood at the base of the conservatory's remains, hands folded, his coat unbuttoned against the chill. He did not flinch as the cuffs were applied, nor did he protest when led to the waiting carriage. He offered Holmes one final glance, curiously free of hatred or even resentment. I only wanted to contain it, he said softly. Holmes replied, but you gave it breath instead. As the wheels rolled away down the drive, I noticed the token still lay where Holmes had placed it in my hand. I bent to retrieve it. It was cold, lifeless, and remarkably ordinary. Yet as I looked at it, I could not help but feel, as I have often felt with Holmes, that the true power in such things lies not in the object, but in the minds that carry them. The return to Baker Street was undertaken in silence. The fields of Surrey rolled past our carriage windows, cloaked in grey mist and the half-light of morning. Holmes leaned back in his corner, long fingers tented before his chin, eyes half-closed but alert, as though still cataloguing the events of Highminster Hall in his remarkable mind. There was no outward display of triumph, no boast, no smile of satisfaction. Only once, when the rooftops of London came into view, did I catch the briefest flicker of expression, a subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth, not of pride, but of confirmation. We ascended the stairs to our lodgings, Mrs. Hudson greeting us with her usual warm fuss. Holmes shed his coat, seated himself at the fireside, and reached for his pipe without a word. Only then did I know he was ready to speak. "It began," Holmes said after a long draw of smoke, "with a journal." He held up a singed scrap, salvaged from the urn, its edges still dark with soot. The fragment bore half a sentence, referencing an eclipse ritual and a god of pestilence. "The Duke," he continued, "was no fool, but like many men of learning, he was susceptible to the theatre of the mysterious. His journal was riddled with esoterica, ceremonial rites, whispered warnings, cryptic diagrams. To most, it would have read as idle curiosity. To Fitch, it was gospel. Holmes tapped ash into the tray. Fitch had spent his life among ruins, dust, and myth. His mind, already steeped in ancient fears, found in that journal a narrative too seductive to dismiss. He came to believe the disc was more than relic. It was a vessel. And once belief had rooted, it mattered not whether the danger was real. He did not fear the object, Holmes added. He feared what it made him imagine, and it was that fear, not the disc, that proved fatal. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. Fitch knew that if the disc were examined, it would be declared unremarkable, a ritual token of modest provenance. His reputation, tied precariously to the myth he had fostered, would unravel. He paused at the window, watching the smoke curl upward into the morning light. "The fire was no act of madness, Watson. It was deliberate and precise. He staged it during the dinner, ensuring that all eyes were diverted. The path of the flames, the placement of the accelerant. It was not meant to destroy indiscriminately, but to suggest catastrophe while preserving key objects." He turned to me. He took the disc, believing it still held power. But more than that, he needed it to vanish so no one could disprove what he had come to believe. "And the others?" I asked. "They were pawns," Holmes replied. "Witnesses to a drama they did not understand, written in a language Fitch had constructed from dust and dread." He sat again, and like all false narratives, it required fire to hide the ink. Holmes's tone deepened slightly, as if the weight of the next truth bore a different gravity. Lord Arlingford had always been suspicious. His disdain for the collection masked a calculating eye. When he witnessed Fitch's behaviour, or perhaps confronted him directly, he saw an opportunity. Holmes steepled his fingers once more. He offered silence in exchange for profit, a sale, a transaction. Perhaps he thought Fitch would agree. Perhaps he underestimated the degree of his fear. He looked at me squarely. Fitch lured him to the orchard under the guise of negotiation, but he had already brought with him the means to silence dissent. The poison, a compound the Duke once noted in his study of ancient rites, was introduced swiftly, cleanly, no mark, no trace. "But the footprints?" I asked. "Miss Grey's, yes," Holmes said. "She had met Arlingford earlier, perhaps to plead or reason, but she left, and Fitch arrived later, alone, to complete the deed." He exhaled quietly. "It was not reason that guided his hand, Watson. It was dread masquerading as necessity." "She was never guilty," Holmes said simply, "only frightened." He rose and moved to the mantel, lifting a photograph that Lady Evelyn had gifted him, a sepia image of the late Duke beside a stone ziggurat. Miss Grey's silence condemned her in the eyes of those who favour clarity over complexity. She feared that her relationship with Arlingford, if revealed, would stain her reputation, and worse, implicate her in matters beyond her grasp. "She bore the full weight of suspicion," I said, and yet spoke nothing in her defence. Holmes nodded. "Because guilt, in the mind of the innocent, often masquerades as shame." He placed the photograph back. She was a casualty not of crime, but of a world too quick to conflate reticence with wrongdoing. And in that moment, I saw in Holmes not only the detective, but the man. The clay disc rested on our table, now wrapped in muslin and awaiting its final destination. Holmes unwrapped it slowly, as though unbinding not merely an object, but a myth. "It is neither cursed nor sacred," he said, turning it in the light. "A ceremonial token, likely used in funerary rites to denote passage or silence. Its symbols are authentic, but common among temple offerings." He handed it to me. It felt surprisingly light. "And yet," he continued, "this inoffensive trinket led to arson, blackmail, and murder, not through power, but through projection." He gestured toward the journal fragment. "The disc meant nothing until a mind filled it with meaning." Fitch, alone in the company of myths and grief, believed it dangerous, and so it became so. I returned the disc to its wrapping with care. How many other relics, I mused aloud, lie waiting for belief to awaken them? Holmes said nothing, but the look in his eyes suggested the question was not unfamiliar to him. Days later, we returned to Highminster Hall for one final task. Lady Evelyn received us in the drawing room, dressed in black but composed, her hands still bearing the faint tremble of one who has buried both husband and illusion. Holmes presented her with the token, now sealed within a velvet case. "I would advise, Your Grace," he said gently, "that it be donated to the British Museum. There it may serve history, not haunt memory." She accepted the case with quiet reverence. "Do you believe it ever held power, Mr. Holmes?" He gave a rare and fleeting smile. "Only the power that men fear," she nodded. "Then let it rest among other stories." We took our leave not long after, and as we passed through the gates of Highminster Hall, I turned once to glance back at the house. It stood, dignified yet changed, as though it too had exhaled after a long-held breath. The case was over. The confession had been made, the arrest carried out, and the final pieces of evidence stored or destroyed. Yet in the soft hush of an autumn dusk, as we returned to our familiar rooms at Baker Street, I sensed the echo of Highminster Hall had not entirely left us. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, a book unopened in his lap, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. Outside, the fog drifted past the windows in slow, idle tendrils, wrapping the street in a pall of quietude. Neither of us spoke for some time. There was nothing that required immediate analysis, no fresh telegrams, no agitated clients. And yet, the air between us remained thick with thought. The kind of silence that settles after a storm, not from peace, but from the magnitude of what has passed. Holmes finally stirred, not with restlessness, but with the weight of reflection. I knew then that his mind was still within the orchard, still tracing the shape of a mind unravelled by fear. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice low but clear, "have you ever considered how willingly men reach for superstition when it suits their needs?" I looked up, expecting a deduction, but instead found a kind of musing in his tone. "Guilt," he continued, "is a heavy burden. The rational man must own it, dissect it, carry it forward. But superstition offers a different path. It grants permission to shift the blame onto fate, onto curses, onto the unknowable." I nodded slowly, and in doing so, spares the conscience. "Precisely," he said. "It does not absolve, but it masks. Fitch was no madman at first. He was a scholar possessed of wit and rigour. But when guilt whispered in the night, he heard instead the voice of ancient gods. And so he gave his guilt a mask, one he could fear instead of face." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "There is no absolution in fire, Watson, only illusion. And illusion is never more dangerous than when the mind welcomes it." Outside, The fog thickened against the panes, as if in silent agreement. "I find myself," I said after a pause, "thinking not of the crime, but of the man." Holmes glanced at me, but said nothing. "Fitch was not cruel," I continued. "There was in him a gentleness, a hesitation even in deceit. He killed, yes, but not as a brute does. It was terror that moved his hand, not malice." Holmes's silence persisted, and I pressed on. "He was a brilliant mind, broken not by ambition, but by fear. And that, I think, is a tragedy deeper than any headline can report." Holmes finally spoke. "You are correct. But brilliance does not inoculate one against collapse. In fact, the finer the mechanism, the more easily it may be thrown out of balance." He folded his hands, his voice softening. "The very intellect that elevates man can also isolate him." Fitch pursued knowledge until it became prophecy. He wandered too far from the empirical, and what he found there within himself was more dangerous than any relic. I thought then of the Duke, of Fitch, of how proximity to forgotten gods can turn even the learned into believers. Holmes rose and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to peer into the thickening gloom. "There is something I wish more men understood," he said, almost to himself. I waited. "It is not belief in the irrational that endangers us. It is the actions belief compels, when logic no longer holds sway. When fear is dressed in ritual, when uncertainty is called omen, men will do what reason would forbid." He turned from the window, the pale light framing his face. "The true peril of superstition, Watson, lies not in statues or symbols, but in the hands it guides. Fitch did not believe he had a choice. That was his failure." "And ours?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "To remind the world that every ghost can be dispelled by daylight. That truth is not always easy, but it is always safer than myth." He returned to his seat, his expression distant. "The danger is not in the fog," he murmured, "but in what we imagine waits within it." I saw then that the case had left its mark on him too, though he wore it, as ever, in silence. Holmes reached for his pipe, filling it with slow, deliberate motions. The room, still warmed by the fire's last embers, filled gradually with the curling trails of smoke, soft, grey, ephemeral. He struck a match, the flame flaring briefly before retreating into glow. "Curious, is it not," he said, "how smoke, whether born of fire or fear, can obscure even the sharpest minds?" I said nothing, for the truth of it lay thick in the air between us. "Fitch burned pages," Holmes continued. "He burned evidence, but he could not burn the idea. And it is ideas, Watson, especially false ones, that linger long after the flame has died." He exhaled, the smoke coiling upward like an unanswered question. "It takes very little to blind a man, a superstition, a whisper, a loss, and in that blindness he may set fire to all he once protected." I watched the pipe smoke drift toward the ceiling and felt the weight of those words settle like ash across the case. No longer embers nor accusation, only aftermath. The lamps burned low, casting golden halos across the panelled walls. Outside, the fog moved like memory, slow, persistent, refusing to lift. Holmes remained in his chair, eyes turned toward the darkness beyond the window, pipe resting idle in his fingers. I sat at my writing desk, recording the final notes of the case. The ink moved slowly beneath my pen, as if it too resisted closure. There are cases that end with triumph, with the clarity of logic vindicated and justice restored. But this was not one of them. Truth had emerged, yes, but it came cloaked in tragedy, in fear, and in the quiet collapse of a man undone by belief. Holmes had spoken his final thoughts, but I knew that somewhere in the folds of his mind the disc still turned, silent, weightless, and waiting. I looked up once more before closing my journal. Holmes had not moved. And so, The night settled in, deep, watchful, and without a sound. As we sat in the quiet of Baker Street that evening, the fog curling gently against the window panes, Holmes remained contemplative, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how often men blame the unseen, superstition, fate, curses, when in truth they fear the clarity of their own choices. Fire may obscure a deed, but never the hand that lit the match." He turned to me, the faintest glint in his eye. "Reason, my dear fellow, is not the enemy of mystery. It is its lantern. What do you think truly consumed Dr. Fitch in the end? The relics myth, or his own belief in it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this case, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And share this story with a friend who loves a clever puzzle wrapped in fog and fear. The game is never truly over.